Right now, an old Ford pickup is still dragging a loaded trailer down a dirt road 50 years after it rolled off the line. Under the hood is a Ford 300 Inline-6. Farmers ran the original engine past 300,000 miles. It was the most reliable engine Ford ever built. It never quit. Nothing better came along, so why would Ford kill it? To understand why Ford would ever put down an engine this good, you have to go back to where it started, and it started in a decade obsessed with everything the 300 was not. The 1960s were the age of the American 5.8. Every company in Detroit was chasing horsepower, building bigger motors, selling muscle and speed and the sound of a quarter mile. The whole industry was pointed at one thing, and that thing was power. A man could brag about at the stoplight. Ford went the other way. In 1965, while the rest of Detroit was selling Mustangs and big block dreams, Ford quietly rolled out a new Inline-6. They built it in two sizes, 240 cubic inches and 300 cubic inches, to replace the older sixes that came before it. There was nothing glamorous about it. It wasn't built to win races or turn heads. It was built to work. Because Ford understood something the horsepower war had forgotten. Not every American needed a Mustang. The farmer hauling feed before sunup didn't care about 0 to 60. Neither did the contractor loading a trailer, or the rancher dragging equipment across a back 40, or the small business owner who needed his truck to start in January and still be running come July. Those men didn't want excitement. They wanted a machine they could trust. One that started every morning, worked all day, and did it again the next day without asking for anything. The 300 was built for them. And the way Ford built it is the whole reason it lasted. Start with the block. Ford cast it out of iron, and they made it thick, thicker than most engines of its day. That heavy iron could take the heat, the pressure, and the abuse for hundreds of thousands of miles and never complain. Some of these engines ran past 250,000 miles without ever being taken apart. Then there was the crankshaft. The 300 rode on 7 main bearings. For a straight 6, that's a lot. Plenty of V8s back then got by on 5. Those 7 bearings held the crank steady along its whole length, so the engine ran smooth and almost never cracked, no matter how hard it was worked. Ford built it like something meant to outlive the man who bought it. The rest of the engine followed the same plain thinking, a simple overhead valve design, the camshaft down in the block, push rods doing the work. Fewer moving parts meant fewer things that could ever break us, and when something finally did go wrong, a man could fix it himself, right there in his own garage. He didn't need a computer or a dealership or any special tool, just a wrench and an afternoon. And there is one more piece of the design that mattered more than most people realize. Almost every engine of that era spun its camshaft with a rubber belt or a metal chain. Both stretch and wear with age, and when one finally slips or snaps, the engine can wreck itself in seconds. Ford used neither. The 300 turned its camshaft with a set of steel and fiber gears, meshed tight and good for hundreds of thousands of miles without ever slipping a tooth. It took away the one failure that quietly ended so many other motors. But toughness was only half of what made the 300 special. The other half was how it put its power down. This engine was never about high revs or big horsepower numbers. What it made was torque, and it made that torque down low, right where the real work gets done. Most V8 engines of the time did their best pulling up around 3,000 or 4,000 RPM. The 300 made its strongest pull way down around 1,500 to 2,000 RPM, putting out somewhere between 240 and 260 pound-feet of torque, depending on the year. In the real world, that meant one thing: you never had to wind it out to get work done. Load the bed down heavy, hook up a loaded trailer, point it at a hill, and the 300 would just dig in and pull. Anybody who ever drove an old F-150 stacked to the rails, crawling up a grade in the cold, and felt that engine growl its way to the top like the weight was nothing, knows exactly what that felt like. That's why Ford ended up putting it in just about everything. It went into F-Series pickups and E-Series vans. It went into U-Haul trucks that got rented out and beaten half to death by strangers every weekend. It ran generators, air compressors, irrigation pumps out in the fields, dump trucks, and lifts on job sites, school buses, tow trucks, even airport tugs. If a job needed an engine that would show up and keep running no matter how rough the work got, the 300 was always on the short list, and over the years, Ford kept it current without ever changing what mattered. The early versions ran a simple carburetor and points ignition. By the late 70s, Ford added electronic ignition to help it start in the cold. And in 1987, they swapped the carburetor for fuel injection, which kept the old 6 modern enough for the times. But through every one of those changes, the heart of the engine stayed exactly the same. Solid torque, easy to fix, and tough enough to outlast the truck wrapped around it. The people who owned them never forgot them. Talk to anybody who ran one, and you hear the same story, told 100 different ways. I drove that truck for 20 years. 300,000 miles. Never once opened the engine. Just oil plugs and air filters. Stories like that weren't the exception. They were ordinary, and they built a kind of loyalty to this engine that most motors never come close to earning. In fact, the 300 earned a reputation so tough that some men set out to test it on purpose. The story goes that owners and mechanics would try to kill one just to see if they could. They ran them low on oil. They ran them hot with no coolant. They pushed them past every limit the manual ever set, and the engine just kept running. Whether every one of those stories is true almost does not matter. People told them because the engine had earned them. So if the 300 was really that good, what was everybody else building? Because Ford was not the only company making a straight 6 for work trucks. The competition proves the 300 was not just Ford loyalty talking. Chevrolet had the 292 Inline-6, and it was no slouch. It was a big, long-stroke 6 that made strong torque down low, and plenty of men swore by it for pulling a loaded truck up a grade. But the 292 had one weakness the Ford did not share. Working hard in the heat under a heavy load, it had a habit of running hot. The 300 just kept its cool and kept pulling. Both were tough engines. The 300 was the one that ended up in everything from delivery vans to airport tugs, racking up the kind of miles that built its name. Then there was American Motors with the 258 Inline-6. The 258 was a good, long-lived engine in its own right, and it found a real home in Jeeps and lighter trucks where it ran for decades. But it was built for a different kind of life. It was made for trails and weekend rigs and light duty, not for sitting in a fleet truck hauling heavy loads every single day for 20 years. Put it to the relentless commercial work the 300 lived on, and it was out of its element. So in the punishing world of heavy daily work, the 300 outlasted both of them. That was not an accident, and it was not marketing. It was the block, the bearings, and the simple design doing exactly what they were built to do. And here is where the story stops making sense. Because by the early 1990s, The 300 had not slowed down. It was still going into Ford trucks. It was still being bought by the people who knew exactly what they were getting. No rival had beaten it. Nobody had built a Work 6 that could outlast it. After almost 30 years, the engine was still doing the one thing it was made to do, better than anything else on the lot. An engine like that should have lived forever. It had earned it. But something had started closing in on the 300, not a competitor, not a better design, something coming from outside the world of trucks and torque and hard work entirely. The men who ran these engines could feel it before they could name it. The rules were changing, and the very things that made the 300 great were about to become the things that doomed it. In 1996, after 31 years, Ford shut the 300 down for good. Not because it failed, because it could no longer keep up with the law. By the middle of the 1990s, the government had tightened the rules on emissions and fuel economy, and it kept tightening them every few years. Engines now had to burn cleaner and sip less fuel, and they had to prove it on a test year after year, or they could not be sold. That was a wall the 300 was never going to climb. Think about what made this engine great. The heavy iron block, the big slow-turning design that made its torque down low, the simple mechanical setup with no complicated electronics deciding how it breathed. Every one of those things was perfect for hard work and long life, and every single one of them was wrong for passing a modern emissions test. The 300 was a thirsty engine that ran rich and breathed the old way, and there was no cheap fix that could change that without changing what the engine was. Ford did the math. Building a clean enough version of the 300 to satisfy the new rules would have cost more than it was worth, when newer V6 engines could hit those targets right out of the gate. So the most reliable engine the company ever built didn't get a redesign. It got a death sentence signed in Washington instead of Detroit. The engine that could run 250,000 miles without a rebuild was retired by a regulation it couldn't pass. And that's the part that still bothers the people who ran them. The 300 didn't die because it stopped working. It died because the things that made it unkillable were the same things the new rules wouldn't allow. A perfectly good engine with hundreds of thousands of honest miles still left in it was legislated off the assembly line. But here's the part Ford couldn't control. All these years later, those engines are still out there, still running, still getting pulled into project trucks by people who would rather trust a 30-year-old 6 than anything with a computer in it. You can kill a model. You can't kill a reputation that was earned 300,000 miles at a time. So why would Ford kill the most reliable engine it ever built? They didn't really, they were forced to. And the next time you hear an old Inline-6 rattling down a back road, 50 years after it was born, remember that it was never the engine that gave up. It was the rules that finally caught it. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and watch the next video above.